Hey guys, and happy Sunday. I hope you all had a great week. And as we're heading into the last 2 weeks of classes, let's think forward. We're going to do this. This is going to be done. Yay! Okay, so this week we're going to be looking at chapter 14 in our text. I think it's chapter 14, Jace, in Europe and the rise of the Christian kingdoms. Now, okay, so we've talked about a lot of movement. We've talked about Islam and the rise of Islam. And we've talked about Christianity and how Christianity, as it spread into Europe, it started to synchronize with local customs in order for Christianity to grow. Christianity was very easy to be absorbed into local culture because Christianity brought with it a belief that even though their life in the moment was very difficult and kind of miserable, honestly, that they were going to have a better life to come after death. So it was easily accepted by people because people were afraid of death, and they were afraid of dying, of course, and death was all around them. Because remember, in this time, there's no concept of germ theory. People don't understand that if they poop in the stream, that downstream, the people who are drinking the water from it could get sick. They didn't understand why some people died when they got sick and why some people got well. They just didn't have an understanding of science at this time. And so a belief that an afterlife was going to be perfect and utopian was a way to deal with the life they were actually living, and gave them a feeling of serenity and just a better feeling about death. But over time, the monks and the Christian leadership, we see the rise of the monastic system, the rise of orders, and where we have Christian men and women in convents come together and live in a community where they worship God, and they really are not out in the public very much. Some orders are, some orders are not. And an order is a particular group of Christian men or women who have joined the monastery or the convent. And then each of these convents / orders have different different concepts of how to worship God, and they practice their worship differently. So as we look at the rise of Christianity into Europe, we see that it is accepted overall quite easily. And since most of the people were poor, the church believed that to be poor was to be godly, and to be wealthy or rich was not a good thing. So, and then the church tried to create laws that are called Canon Laws that really their intention was to control people's behavior, and in that control, build the strength and the power dynamic of the church. And that the church, Christianity, in the time that we're talking, 700s, 700s, 800s, this is a time when the only Christianity in Western Europe came from the Pope in Rome, and that therefore became the Roman Catholic religion of Christianity, or version, I should say, of Christianity. Now remember, in the East, in Constantinople, in Greece, you have the Greek Orthodox, and in Russia, we have the Russian Orthodox. So we do see the Catholic Church creating divisions of how they worship and who is in charge. The Pope, just to go back a little bit, the Pope was one of 5 bishops of Christianity, leaders of Christianity. And after Rome was sacked in the 400s, and the Roman Senate had left in the 300s, Rome was left to fend for itself. And the Bishop of Rome, who we now call the Pope, became not only the leader of the faith, but also really a civic leader. He had to take on the role of governance. And so it's very easy when you look at it from that perspective, why in Europe the role of the church became one of governance and also of leading the faith in worship, because it was a natural outgrowth of what the Pope in Rome and the Catholics in Rome had to deal with. But it became very, very powerful. And the people, the monks, the priests, were really the only people who were able to read in that time. You don't really see education being part of the landscape of all of culture and humanity in Europe. So the only people who know how to read and write are going to be those members of the church, which give them a great deal of power. Now, as your textbook points out, you see the rise of Charlemagne. So Charlemagne, Charles the Bald, Charles the Great, he is the king of a very large region of Europe, and he becomes in 800 somebody called the Holy Roman Emperor. So it's a title that's given to him. And people who study Charlemagne believe that Charlemagne didn't really accept that role of Holy Roman Emperor. And part of the reason was that Charlemagne was really a very interesting leader, a man unto himself. He ruled over a very large portion of Europe that went into France and Germany. He was a member of the Carolingians, a member of the tribe of the Franks, so he was German. His capital city was in Aachen, Germany. And at that time, around the late 700s, early 800s, under his rule, there was really a first revival or rebirth, renaissance of education and diversity. He welcomed to his court people who were Jewish, people who were Muslim. The church, the church body politic, was really this undercurrent that existed in Europe under Charlemagne's rule that kept trying to pop up in different areas under his control in his kingdom to reestablish control over different populations. And Charlemagne was a strong enough leader that he was able to snuff them out like whack-a-mole. So every time the church rules would pop up that were very restrictive and very strict, he would pop them down, he'd squash them down, and then they'd pop up somewhere else, and he'd squash them down. And during the entirety of his reign, he was able to do that. But once he died, he had 3 sons, and the kingdom ended up being divided among those 3 sons, and they didn't have the strength that he had. They didn't have the leadership quality that he had. And as a result, it created a power vacuum in Europe. And that power vacuum eventually led to smaller kingdoms rising up to protect the people. And you see then the development of the manorialism and the feudalism, which is relationships based rule and governance. between the lord of the manor, who owned all kinds of land, like we've talked about when we were in class and we were talking about China. This is the same situation. Feudalism is feudalism. So feudalism is inherently based on relationships, and where one person is going to protect another person, and for that protection, they're going to give something to that protector. So it's a series of relationships that go down the social hierarchy and back up the social hierarchy. Now, eventually, with feudalism, we see the development, and manorialism, we see this development of fiefdoms and serfs. So peasants, who are essentially tied to the land, and they're unable to move. They are really under the direct power of their landlords, or under the social hierarchy that exists. There's no concept of social mobility for these peasants. They're stuck. They're tied completely to the land. They are at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. That will change as we go forward. Now, what makes it change? Well, a couple things make it change. The first thing that makes it change are the Crusades. So remember when I was saying just a second ago that under Charlemagne's rule, you see the church trying to come up and create laws and restrictions, and Charlemagne's rule is so strong, it just pops it down. It can't survive. So, but in the power vacuum after Charlemagne's death, the church gets a foothold in that power vacuum and begins to rise, and really rise to the top. And eventually, there's going to be a skirmish between who has the most power, really. Is it going to be the church, or is it going to be the kings? And then there's a war that takes place, and in the end, at around in the middle of the 11th century, and in the end, the church is the leader. The church rules everybody, and they rule through their legitimacy of God, gives them their legitimacy, and the church threatens any king or any leader with excommunication if they don't follow what the church's guidelines are. And excommunication for these folks is something that is nobody wants, because the church, if the church excommunicates you, then you're going to hell right away. You're doomed, completely doomed for all eternity. And any king that does that, they're not only being excommunicated, but they're basically excommunicating all people in their kingdom. And they don't want to doom everyone in their kingdom to a life in hell, an eternity in hell. And so the church is able to keep their stronghold on these folks until we see the Protestant Reformation, and we'll go into that next week. But the church has a very big stronghold. Now, here's the thing about the church. So there's good and there's bad in everything. And the church is good in that it gives people a belief that their life is meaningful. It gives people a belief that there is life after death, that gives them comfort, that someone has gone to a better place. They're with Jesus, they're with God, they're in a better place. And that, my gosh, that's a really wonderful feeling. But the church also does some not so great things. One of the things that the church does is so keep in mind, to be poor is good in this time period, according to the church. And so anyone who they deem wealthy or moneyed or know how to deal with money is bad. And who are they? Muslims and Jews. So Muslims are not in this well, they're beginning in this time period to encroach on Christian kingdoms. And so in the Balkans and in Eastern Europe, there's a lot of conflict. There are a lot of wars that are happening, and that's where we get this, where we get Dracula in the Balkans. He is Christian, he is Catholic, and he is fighting against Muslims. And the leadership in his community wants to make a truce with the Muslims, the Turks, and he ends up impaling those leaders. He brings them all to dinner. He says, "Come on in." And these are all Christian clerics. They're the Christian leadership of his community who are compromising with the Muslims, who are at their door trying to come in and live in that area in the Balkans. And so what does he do? He brings them all in, and he has dinner with them, and then he kills them quite brutally, and he impales them. And that's the beginning of Vlad the Impaler, who eventually becomes the persona of Dracula, or Dracula takes on that persona. And also where George Martin of Game of Thrones gets the idea for the Red Wedding. So George Martin really knew his history. But it is that encroachment, this growth of Islam that is coming into Europe that the Christians are trying to fight against and maintain their Christian kingdoms. And one of those kingdoms that the Muslims have is in the Holy Land. So by 1096, we see the very first Crusades. Now, what's interesting about the Crusades is that they are obviously Catholic, Christian-led. They're Christian-led. Now, Christianity in this time period is really about power and control. Some of the Christians really believe in what they are talking about. They really do believe that to be holy meant that the worship of God in all forms, as a Christian, really did help people. They did help the poor. There were some good things and there were some genuine people who were religious and genuinely believed what they believed. Unfortunately, though, not all of them did. And in this time period, if you weren't Christian, then you could not own land. So people who were Jewish, primarily Jewish, could not be a farmer. The Canon Law, Christian law, did not allow them to be farmers, so they could not own land. They could not be part of crafts guilds. So in the wool industry or in building industry or in metal industry, metallurgy, being blacksmiths, none of those regular things. They couldn't be bakers. They couldn't do any of that kind of stuff, because in order to do that and do it legitimately, you had to join a crafts guild. And when you joined a crafts guild, you had to take an oath. And that oath was a similar oath that vassals and fiefs and knights would take to their lord or leadership. And that oath always included, "In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ." Well, obviously, you could not do that if you were Jewish. So it marginalized the Jewish population in Europe greatly. And that marginalization made Jews by default become merchants, and traveling merchants at that. So and as a merchant, you're handling money more often than a regular person, and therefore you had on your person, your body, in your cart, your traveling cart of goods, real money, tangible money, So there were some things that you sold through the barter system and other things that you sold through real coin. And that real coin was what was very difficult to come by back in those days. And just like nowadays with the agricultural industry, farmers had a hard time making ends meet. And they were usually very poor. And if there was a bad season, then they had to borrow money in order to make ends meet and then to be able to buy seed for the next year. This is still very much the way it is in the modern world. One of the reasons why small farmers have a really hard time against the large agricultural monopolies like Monsanto and such. So this is still very much part and parcel of being a farmer in today's world, and why most farmers, family farmers, are more conservative because they have to, fiscally conservative because, they really have to do a lot more saving, and they have to be very careful how they're spending their money. And why the federal government in the United States augments them and helps provide them with agricultural loans or subsidizes, or meaning helps to buy their goods so that they have a more steady stream of income. So, but this is not the case back in the Middle Ages. And so what did these Christian farmers do? Well, they went to the Jews to borrow money, because the Jews, like I said, by default, would have more real coin on them. And so many of these Christian farmers were indebted to the Jews. Well, the Christian leadership did not like that, really, and one of the ways, and they encouraged bigotry, they encouraged prejudice, and they didn't like the Jews because the Catholics who were in power, the leadership, sold the concept, the idea that Jews killed Jesus and therefore did not deserve their respect. So it was a really interesting dynamic, and as a result, one of the results was that Jews were always marginalized until we see the rise of towns, but also when it came to the Crusades, how do you get men to fight for the Crusades, fight in the Crusades, going down to Jerusalem, to the Holy Land, to win back the Holy Land from the Muslims? And it is at this time of the Crusades where we really see, even though the Jews and the Christians are not really getting along, the real angst was between the Christians and Muslims. So, and so the kings are able to, in Europe, are able to gather peasants and regional aristocracy to come together to go to the Holy Land, Jerusalem, and to fight against the Muslims. And one of the ways they do that is they say, all you farmers, if you are indebted to the Jews, we will cancel your debts if you will come and join us. Now, did they tell the Jews they'd pay for those debts on behalf of those farmers? Oh, no. So many farmers who were indebted to the Jews took that offer with their picks and shovels in their hands, honestly, and walked to the Holy Land. Now, the Crusades were really a game changer in many respects. One of them was that the Christian leadership believed that education outside of the belief in God as being this, and earth all being at the center of the universe, was heresy. It was horrible. It was, it was wrong. And by claiming that, they did a couple things. One is that they limited knowledge. They did not embrace science. They didn't embrace knowledge. They didn't embrace education. They didn't embrace writing, because if they did that, they would lose control and they would lose power. And that was a very big deal. So when they went down to the Promised Land or to the Holy Land, they created a lot of problems. They destroyed the library in Alexandria, Egypt, the great library, which even now, to this day, is a hurt in so many historians' hearts, because you had original manuscripts and scrolls from Aristotle and from Plato and great minds of the ancient world, and the Christians destroyed it. The Christians they just said nope, so that's heresy. We can't have education. They went into Jerusalem and they fought the Muslims who were living there as invaders, and they did take back Jerusalem for a time, but they lost it again. And they eventually lose it for good under the leadership in 1200s, 1300s, under the leadership of General Saladin. He was the greatest general in all of Islamic history. And he really was a good general. He offered to the Christians to surrender, and he wouldn't kill anybody. And the Christians, of course, said no, and they were going to lose. And once they did lose, many Christians died in the last battle with Saladin. And those who did live, they actually let them just live and leave. They didn't. It wasn't death to the last man, which I dare say would not be the same if the Christians had won. So. And I say that not as when you look at the history, you look at what they did, it's not a difficult conclusion to come to. Now, so the Crusades did a couple things. One of the things that the Crusades did is, for those who actually made it, to the Holy Land, they were introduced to an amazing world, Tomorrowland. I mean, like crazy difference in the world they came from. So the world they came from in Europe, at the time of the First Crusade, people in Europe were living in mud huts. I've mentioned this before. They had one thing that they wore. They were filthy. They never thought of it. Once a year they would bathe, but they thought that if they bathed, that if they were clean, that they would be allowing germs or bad, things to happen to them. They really had a backwards way of understanding their world and their place in it, and they didn't believe in science. And their teeth were rotting out of their head. I mean, it was really gross, just super, super gross. And then they go down into Jerusalem and in the Middle East, the remnants of the Holy Roman Empire, and it is crazy, amazing, beautiful. People bathed. It was the buildings were beautiful. It was like going from a shack in the modern world to going to a beautiful, $1 million home. It was just that different. They didn't even know what to do with themselves. Now, some folks who lived through the battles, some Europeans actually stayed, and to this day have people European descent still live in the Middle East, and are modern day Lebanese people, modern day Israelis, modern day Palestinians, modern day Jordanians. There's a lot of people who there's a large portion of the population in the Middle East who have European roots and ancestry. Because they said, why would I want to go back? This is absolutely beautiful place, and I wouldn't want to go back. I mean, they had spices, and remember, there were 7,000 years of trade in that area, whereas Europe, unless the Romans had been there, they were not accustomed to anything. So that was a pretty big deal. And then there were some who said, you know what, I'm going to take this stuff back to Europe. And as a result of those guys going back to Europe, what did they do? They started having traveling like flea markets, what we would call flea markets. And they'd go from town to town, and there would be, they'd go to place. And this would be on the land of the lords, right? The lords who lived there in the manorial system. And they would go and they would talk to the lord of the manor, and they would say, can we have like a fair or a festival? That's what they would call it. And it would be a flea market, and it would be fun for the kids and games and things like that. And that's where you would trade for silks, which would be first, or fruits, which would be a first, like oranges. England and Europe were not they couldn't grow oranges. Now, yes, in Spain they could, and around the lower part of the Mediterranean, like France and Italy, they could grow citrus, but Northern Europeans did not have that kind of citrus. And so they were introduced to new kinds of fruits and new kinds of vegetables, and at these kinds of flea markets. And over time, those flea markets became settled towns. And in those settled towns, you see the rise of these large cathedral churches, and then with that came this change of heart about wealth by the church, because the church was benefiting from these towns. The church was benefiting from the wealth of the parishioners, the wealth of the population, the increase in livelihoods for locals. But now the church did not know, and the local people did not know how to handle real money, real coin. And so around Germany and France and in England, you see, especially in Germany and France, you see new towns that were developing. The leaders of these towns, burgermeisters, this is where you get the idea of suburbs. So these folks needed to learn how to manage money and how to manage civil law as opposed to religious law, and things like that. Because when you have a rise of towns, there's building, you have to figure out septics, how do people live on top of one another? They're obviously not landowners. None of these people are landowners, because only people who own land are the lords. So how do they manage their money so that the lords are going to get a share of the money? And so who did they bring in to learn how to manage money? Well, that's where you have the big Jews. Jews come in, Jewish people are asked by these towns to come in and teach people how to manage money and develop civil government. And so they do. And once they learn, they kick them out and they marginalize them, which is where you get the term ghetto. The first ghettos in Europe are the places where the Jews are marginalized and made to live after they've taken care of the towns and taught the townspeople how to manage money. And so that's where the Jews end up living. And once again, they're marginalized again, and limited with what they're able to do. And in order to maintain that marginalization, especially in Germany, that's where you see the beginnings of what we call the Passion Play. Jesus Christ Superstar, Godspell. Every Easter you have passion plays. Well, where do those passion plays come from that show that it was Caiaphas, it was the Jews, the Jewish leadership in the Sanhedrin that doomed Jesus to death and killed God, basically? Germany. That's where you get the very beginnings of it. And so with that knowledge, you can see how World War II was able to happen, and the Holocaust specifically. So anti-Semitism grew. So it was always there under the surface. It was an undercurrent with the rise of Christianity. So you have the Crusaders, you see the rise of towns, and with the rise of towns, you see more people living closer together. So that by the 1300s, with the rise in towns, you have rise in trade, you have rise in trade routes, and in the 1300s, what comes in but the Black Death. So it is the first pandemic that we are made aware of. And in that pandemic, it eventually spreads over the continent of Europe, killing 1/3 of the population. And when it does kill 1/3 of the population, it changes up everything. It upends everything. And so people who were living under the manorial system and were serfs, they were peasants that were tied to land, and there was no upward social mobility. They are now released from that. And the Black Plague it kills aristocracy as well as it kills people who are poor. But because 1/3 of the population is killed, we see the beginning of the movement, a shift of people migrating around Europe. And we see for the first time the chance for upward social mobility from people who had never had that opportunity before. We see a shift in who becomes aristocracy. We see a shift to from local manorial kingdoms to larger kingdoms, and the belief in absolute monarchy, absolute rule that is divinely given. Because how do you explain something like the Black Death pandemic to people who do not understand germ theory or understand science, really? And the Black Death is a springboard to scholasticism, to humanism, to what we will eventually see next week in the Renaissance. Rebirth of science, of understanding, of knowledge. It's people both who are in the religious community as well as the secular community trying to really understand what happened, why did this happen, how to make sense of it. So there's a lot happening in about 300 or 400 years, and in, what is this, 37, 38 minutes of a mini lecture. Obviously, we can't cover all of it, but I want you to look at this, read through your chapter. It is a movement. It gives us some continuity of thought and understanding of how we get to the Renaissance, and then the rise of scientific theory and understanding, the rise of, again, a philosophy of evaluating the world, scholasticism. How do we evaluate the world? The ideas of humanism that lead to enlightenment, that move the human population and collective thinking forward. So, and take us out of the Middle Ages. So I hope you all enjoy the readings. Remember, don't forget to do Launchpad. Email me anytime you need to. I'm here for you. We got this. We got this. Stay with it. Stick to it. Stick to it. You can start uploading your presentations into the Blackboard and the discussion forum titled Presentations. Remember, they're due on Saturday, a week from, in 7 days, right? From today, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, 7 days. Yeah, from today. And make sure that if you have any problems, give me a shout. But they do need to be put up there. If you have any issues with uploading them, please contact the IT Student Help Desk, and they will help you. The number will be in Blackboard. All right. Love you. Mean it. I hope you have a great day and a great week, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Okie dokie.